The other day we discussed how the book was put together and maybe how we should start to read it. That was the how day. Today, as I mentioned, is the why day. Why should we care about this book that's 170 years old? Why should we think that these themes are still relevant for us? That's what we're going to cover today. And the first biggie is the idea of justice. If you remember from our history discussions the last 2 weeks, we heard the idea of the general will. Mr. Harris talked a lot about that. And it was the highest standard. The Constitution of 1791 stipulated, this is from Sister Revolutions, that there is no authority in France higher than the law. Which is a little bit scary because we have some other interpretations of that. But we see how justice is carried out wrongfully throughout this book, and it happens on both sides. So we see the injustices occur when Manette and Darnay, the protagonists of our story, are obviously wrongfully imprisoned because they're perceived to be agents agents against the state. So they're imprisoned by the agents of the state. And then the revolutionaries act unjustly toward the state and anyone else who gets in their way. So there's justice from the top down, there's injustice from the top down. There's injustice rising back up from the bottom up, and no one seems to have the best idea of how we should be behaving ourselves in a just way. So that's what's covered in our Sister Revolutions book very well. Let me repeat a couple things that maybe you didn't notice in our chapters from last week. Interesting quotes. Everything must be allowed to those who are headed in the same direction as the revolution. Thus, all forms of repression, persecution, and violence could hide behind the mask of revolutionary law. Illegality was necessarily consubstantial with the revolution. All right? In order to have a revolution, we must break the law, is essentially what we're saying there. We also see how this plays out, and this sounds like it's directly out of Dickens on the next page, 158. The first law of terror enacted in March 1793 called for indiscriminate arrest and summary justice. This is where the trials in the book go to. Individuals accused of infractions against the revolution were assumed to be guilty and had to prove their innocence. They had no right to trial by jury and no right of appeal. But they were granted speedy trials. All those arrested had to be tried and executed within 24 hours. So when we see that this was actually going on, we can understand in the text where they're just filing people through the courtroom and they're like, guilty, 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 sentenced to death, sentenced to death. This was actually going on. The scary thing is when the legislature starts to blend with the judiciary. We've been talking about how our system keeps those separate, and this is why. We hear from Montesquieu back in Sister Revolutions as well. As he had observed, when the judiciary is absorbed into the legislature's power over citizens' lives and freedom becomes arbitrary. It's just whoever is in control at that moment. There's no set rules for anyone to follow. So, what we see is a guy like Robespierre. He says, revolutionary government had displaced constitutional government and public freedom had eclipsed the freedom of the individual. He says this, under a constitutional regime, it suffices to protect individuals against abuses by the public power. Yeah, that's true. That's a good thing. But under a revolutionary regime, see how it gets flipped. The public power, which becomes the revolutionaries, itself is obliged to defend itself against all the factions that attack it. So again, the injustice that they're complaining about from the previous rule gets inverted, and they end up doing the exact same thing to the people that they're supposedly trying to liberate. We see how these philosophies mirror some of the things we've already been talking about. Towards the end of the book, in Book 3, we see examples of utilitarian thinking pretty clearly. Let me just give you a couple quick sentences. When they're talking to Dr. Manette, they say, as to what is dearer to you than life, nothing can be so dear to a good citizen as the Republic. The Republic The greater good is more important than individual people and families. We see it a few pages later as we get near the end of the book. The good physician of the Republic would deserve better still of the Republic by rooting out an obnoxious family of aristocrats, and would doubtless feel a sacred glow and joy in making his daughter a widow and her child an orphan. There was wild excitement, patriotic fervor, and not a touch of human sympathy. So again, the idea that we've covered already with utilitarianism, that there is a greater good, and it doesn't matter who gets in your way. If it needs to be we need to take violent action, so be it. It's for the greater good. And everything becomes a measurement. Right? It's like we put people on scales and say, well, this is more important, so it doesn't matter what happens to them. And so we can see the philosophies we've been talking about, how when they run amok, this is what happens. The idea of utilitarianism also shows up in another of Dickens' books, just real quickly, that I talk about in my class of the history of the novel. We talk about the novel Hard Times, which is actually his shortest book, so we can zip through it pretty quickly in that semester. But it also has characters in it that are constantly weighing the greater good. So there's business owners and schoolmasters who are constantly saying, well, what's the most important value for all of us? Not what you think is true, not what you think is good. It's always about the larger community. So just another book recommendation for you. You know, we might think, oh, well, this is old stuff. This is referencing something 200 years ago. These things don't still occur. I don't know if you've been watching some of the news lately, but there have been some riots in various cities. There was one in Portland, I think, recently. There's footage of this little old guy and little old lady driving, and people like bashing on their car and pulling them out, and just wild stuff. I mean, these are people who have nothing to do with anything. They're just strolling through, and they're getting mobbed by incredibly angry people. And I'm going to offer a quote to you that I don't want you to read too far into it. I just want to show you the truth of it. In responding to some of those outbursts of civil unrest, Hillary Clinton said on television, "You cannot be civil with a political party that wants to destroy what you stand for, what you care about." That's her interpretation of the other side. That's why I believe if we are fortunate enough to win back the House and or the Senate, that's when civility can start again. So the ends justify the means. Violence now, and we promise, will be peaceful when we're in charge. Sure. That sounds exactly like something Robespierre would say. So whenever I can connect a current politician to someone like Robespierre, it's a good day. If someone on the other side would have said that, just to cover my bases, I would have repeated the same quote. I have no allegiance to any of them. I mostly despise all politicians, so I'm not picking on her. So back to sister revolutions. Here's what Edmund Burke, the English conservative, you might call him, he said, "I shall rejoice," commented the great foe of the French Revolution. He didn't like it. As he lamented the degradation of legal rights and the disappearance of justice across the Channel, in seeing a judicial power established in France, this is what he's hoping for, when they are not called upon to put any man to his trial upon undefined crimes of state, when victims shall not be snatched from the fury of the people to be brought before a tribunal itself, subject to the effects of the same fury, I shall rejoice in seeing such a happy order established in France.